Good morning, wherever you are. My name is Will Drzymski, and you are listening to the Worship Reformation Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the theology and application of the Reformed, classical or traditional style of Reformed congregational worship. Thank you for joining us. Now, for those of us who adhere to the classical or traditional style of worship in church, we like our hymn books. And there's always one problem about hymn books, typically across any church that you go to, and that is that typically there's one or two songs that your church really enjoys to sing, or that you enjoy singing as a family, that you can't find in the hymn book. And there's a couple solutions to this problem. One is that you can always print off the extra songs in the bulletin, or you can put them up on the screen, or you can um, uh, I don't know, publish your own hymn book. Um, now, my friend Brian Jensen, who is on the show today, has done or is in the process of doing just that, publishing his own hymn book. Now, Brian is the pastor of a Reformed Baptist church in Pearland, Texas. Did I say that right?
Pearland, that works.
Pearland. All right. Well, Brian, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, brother. It's really good to be here.
So, in your church is about, well, it's pretty average size, I would say, for a healthy
Yeah,
church.
we're not a large congregation, 150, so
Yep.
right now regular attenders.
Sure. Yep. I'd say that's about perfect for a lot of. I'd say that's a very sweet spot for a
I
congregation.
think so. Yeah,
Yeah. Yep. Now so as I mentioned, you've recently tackled the rather monstrous project of publishing your own Psalter hymnal. Not necessarily just a hymnal, it's a Psalter hymnal. Uh,
that's right.
so what degree of crazy do you have to be to start a project like this?
Um, you, that's a good question. I think you need to be fairly crazy if you want to tackle something like this. It's been something we've been chewing on for probably 10 years and just dreaming, imagining if we were to do something like this, what would we want it to look like? And then the last couple of years, we've been actively working on it. Um, there are. I think about those spheres of knowledge we talk about. There are the things that you know going into this. Um, we knew certain things we would want to included in something like this. We knew some distinctives that we hoped would mark the sort of project that we wanted to tackle, and probably that alone would make us crazy. Um, there are all the things we knew we didn't know. I've never published a book before. I don't know anything about the world of publishing. I don't know anything about securing copyright or working with a printer. And then there are all the things I don't know that I don't know. What sort of things am I going to run into? Is this going to even be feasible? Can we get off the ground here? Is it something we can even afford to do as a congregation? So yeah, I think you need to be a little crazy. It's been kind of overwhelming at times, but pretty rewarding as well.
Cool. Now you guys had a hymn book, but did you have a hymn book before this that you used as a church?
Well, so we don't own our own facilities as a congregation, and so that presents logistical challenges. There's a local church that we rent from, and they've been very gracious to host us. So we actually don't own hymnals of our own. The church that we rent from has hymnals in the pew. Unfortunately, they're not. It's not the greatest hymnal. It's a probably middle 2000s Baptist hymnal with Hillsong and some other stuff in there. And so we use that occasionally, but we have been stuck for the most part projecting lyrics on the screen, distributing paper copies on occasion when we want to teach something new and get the actual music in front of somebody. That's been part of the impetus behind this project for sure.
You haven't had a hymnal of your own as a church, and so you're kind of looking around at the resources that you could get or that's immediately available to you, and it's brought home the fact that it would be really nice to have your own, you know, your own book that you have. Yeah, yeah.
For sure.
But now, has your church sung psalms as part of the worship liturgy?
We we have. I've been serving at the church for 15 years. We have not always sung psalms, but a good number of years ago became convicted that that needed to change. And I'm an elder in the church, but also a musician, and so I made a strategic decision. We were going to start actively working to implement psalm singing, and um, so we have not had a psalter, but that is something that we have sought to introduce. We have a hymn or psalm of the month that we introduce probably most months of the year. We have something that we introduce, and probably 50% of those are psalms. So in the last 5 to 7 years, you know, we've got a fairly decent repertoire of psalms that the church has become accustomed to singing.
Cool. Are psalms better than hymns? Why sing psalms? Uh,
Good
why get
question.
started on singing psalms when you already know hymns?
Yeah, for one, we are commanded to sing psalms in the scriptures, and so it's not optional for churches. Um, they there are many good hymns out there, and we can talk about our hymns permissible, but we are commanded to sing psalms to the Lord, and so we need to walk in obedience to that. We know that God has given us a songbook in the canon to sing, and we know that that is inspired, and so um, there are lots of good reasons, but that's a starting point. God has inspired a songbook that He's already given the church for us to sing.
Right. So why would we not start there? Right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So there's another ditch on the other side of the road, kind of related to that, which is the kind of the exclusive psalmody position. Um, as you mentioned, there's a lot of reasons to sing psalms, but then there's kind of a weird ditch of people where they say, only sing psalms. Hymns are not permissible in church. What would you say to kind of that perspective? Because obviously you're publishing a Psalter hymnal. Um,
Yeah,
so you would be of the position that it's permissible to sing both.
for sure.
So what's kind of the rebuttal to that position?
Yeah. Um, you know, you could look at a couple passages of scripture, and some discussions and debates kind of deteriorate around how you understand the language of singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. But this much we know, we are repeatedly commanded in the scripture to sing new songs to the Lord. Um, you have the singing of hymns to the Lord, songs of praise for victory that He's brought to His people, songs of lament and sorrow. You think of David's lamentation. Um, that some things that predate the book of Psalms itself in the canon, things that follow after in the Old Testament. Christ sang psalms with His disciples, or a hymn with His disciples after the institution of the Lord's Supper. Paul and Silas. Um, Revelation 15, you have a picture of going back to not the book of Psalms, but the Song of Moses and the Lamb. And and so I think there's ample biblical warrant and precedent to sing and to sing a new song to the Lord.
Yeah, even in the Psalms, sing a new song to the Lord in Psalm 98, and I believe
Yes.
96 as well,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. And then yeah, all the different times throughout Scripture where they sang a new song right there on the spot,
Right.
celebrating God's victory, or in Revelation sang a new song like you mentioned. Yep, very very neat. So as you're looking through, you've decided as a church that we would like to sing psalms, we'd like to sing hymns, we want to have our own book, in our own hands that we own. Um, I imagine you looked through some other Psalter hymnals that were currently on the market, um, but you've decided to write your own. What was kind of the um, thought process around that? Not doing the ones that have already been published, but publishing one on your own.
Yeah. Um, well, I'm a again, I'm both a pastor and a musician. Probably that together that means I've got some particularly strong convictions around some of these things. Um, I I also am thinking about the particular setting that I find myself in contextually as a local church and what we sing and what our people are familiar with. That is a factor. Um, we did look out on to see what was available on the market and didn't find anything that really even approximated what we wanted to produce. There are some psalters and hymnals that are strong in certain areas, but then weak in others. And hymnals, particularly, you'll find some that are overly triumphalistic, um, especially depending on what period of time they were produced. But you find little in the way of things that people can sing when they're dealing with suffering and affliction and heartache and that sort of thing. Um, that's one thing for sure that the Psalms can help us with because they reflect that whole corpus of Christian experience and redemptive history from creation to fall and redemption and consummation. Um, you know, there are some things that you discover when you start looking at different psalters and hymnals. I have a big collection of psalters and hymnals that have been published over since the printing press really was developed. But one of the things that you find in, I think most of them, I think this is a fair assessment, is they tend to be very much tied to a particular culture or a church tradition or a period of time. And so everything winds up sounding pretty similar. Um, so take the Genevan Psalter, for example. And if you just think musically about what you find there are many excellent tunes which we have drawn from for our Psalter, but most of them are going to be unfamiliar to people today. They're going to be challenging for most people, and they all sound quite similar. Um, the same is true with more modern hymnals. If you fast forward to the early 20th century, uh, to things that a lot of folks in my generation and my parents' generation would be familiar with, everything starts to sound Fanny Crosby-esque. Um, and we wanted to steer away from that. We wanted, you know, to not just be different, but to try to pull from what we believed would be the very best of uh, psalters and hymnals from as much of church history as we could, different styles, different approaches, um, and just put on tap the best that we believe the church had to offer that had been produced in the last 500 plus years. Um, on the Psalter side, there are different approaches that people take in publishing things. Some Psalters tend to use only familiar tunes, and that can be a really good place, a good way to get people started in singing psalms. Uh, but if I play the Nettleton hymn tune, people may not know that name, but once I start playing it, their minds are going to immediately go to "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and those lyrics are associated in the hearts and minds of God's people with that tune. That's an excellent learning device. Um, if I play martyrdom, people are going to think of "Alas, and did my Savior bleed?" Well, both of those can be helpful for learning a psalm tune, but it can also be good to expand out from there and provide some tunes that are unique to psalm settings so that after you sing those enough, they become what you identify that psalm with, and they can help you learn. Music is a great tool for God's people. When I presented this project to our church, um, one of the things I emphasized was how how much of a gift music itself is to the church. And most people cannot quote very many sentences from my sermon last week, but they have this whole body of psalms and hymns memorized that they'll never lose. So we work through lots and lots of psalters and hymnals. You find some strange things when you're pouring through them. Um, every once in a while, we found a psalter, for example, where you would have an imprecatory psalm or a psalm of lament that was set to some kind of happy clappy sort of tune. It was, just bizarre. It didn't fit. Um, Designing your own gives you the liberty to make things suitable and work on things like that. We also wanted to include some of the better contemporary psalms and hymns out there. Thankfully, there has been a resurgence of hymn writing in recent years. It's not all on the same level of quality, but there's some solid things out there. And we wanted to include some of that. Um, some folks kind of give you the idea that old hymns are sacrosanct just by virtue of their age, and that's not necessarily the case. There's some things that have hung around for whatever reason that need to die. They need to go quietly into that good night. Um, but we were looking for the best of the best and things that would endure.
And publishing your own hymnal allows you, or your own Psalter hymnal, would allow you to draw from the best of the best. And from your position, like I said, you've collected, and I've got the same problem. I collect hymn books, and Psalters.
It's a disease.
Yep. So you've got all these different books on your shelf, and they've got, once you have enough Psalters on your shelf, you get quite a few different combinations of this tune, these lyrics, to multiple different psalms. And even if you don't like those, typically you'll find some metered psalm in there that has a meter to a different tune that you like better.
That's
Um,
right.
and so there's a lot of resources that we have today that typically that the church has not had, up until recent actually. Um, well, we we lost it and we're gaining it back again, but
Yeah,
uh, it's been good. So, and then I like um your point on you run across some of the Psalters, and you run into some kooky tune combinations,
for
um,
sure.
or just
And
weird ones even.
absolutely, there are some Psalters that are just frankly full of mind-numbingly boring tunes in certain traditions,
Yep.
and there there are better things out there.
We have thousands of tunes. We got
Yeah,
this book with 600 of them, and a lot of them aren't catchy. Is not the end
that's
goal,
right. That's right.
but it does. I mean,
Tuneful.
there's so many good tunes out there. Why would we not put some good tunes
That's
in?
right.
And a
That's
lot
right.
of it, I think a lot of it is based on, what's the easiest way we can get a tune to fit with this verse. Maybe our church knows it, or the guy who's writing our music for the other ones can just whip something up real quick and fill one in. I don't have to spend a lot of time on the phone seeking the copyright for this other,
Yeah,
because the other people have it. I want to say that that's probably a reason that there's a lot of Psalters that are lacking in that area, is because it's easier just to pull something off the shelf that doesn't quite fit, but it puts music to words, and you don't have to do more copyright headache to get it there.
yeah.
So, um, what else do I? And then there's like yeah, old, really really old tunes, kind of along the same lines, because during the time of the Reformation, there was kind of the same problem. You had a lot of people just writing scores to every single psalm, and some of them were good, and some of them were not quite as catchy. They didn't
Yeah,
quite fit with the lyrics, and a lot of them, like take the Genevan Psalter for instance, has a very different cadence to it than what our modern ears are used to.
yeah,
Which sometimes we just need to get out of our shell and experience some good music from other
right.
from other points in church history. On the other hand, there's also the ditch of, why are we making this more complicated for ourselves?
Sure.
I like the point you made of, let's start with what people know. There's a lot of good hymn tunes that people know that haven't been applied to Psalms. Let's apply those first, and then we can fill in with some other things
Yeah,
that are easily caught on, that sound tuney
yeah,
for lack of better words, that it's got a predictable musical flow to it. That's a big one. There's a lot of psalters, well, a lot of tunes within one psalter in particular, that it felt like they were just filling in the gaps
yeah,
in their copyright, or within their repertoire, and all of them were copyrighted, of course, because it's there
hmm,
too.
yeah,
But there were so many of them where it's like, that it falls kind of flat. There's no real musical um, creativity here. It's just it's a lot of chords put together
yeah,
over top
exactly.
top of lyrics. So Gregory Wilbur is an example of a modern,
Yeah,
done a really good job at composing um, musically creative, um, musically attractive tunes and setting them to psalms. I've liked that. So
we've included several of his.
yeah, yep.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I appreciate him. What? As you jumped into this, what was the process of designing a hymn book?
Yeah. It's a massive undertaking. The first thing I did is I carried down from my study to my piano, um, probably what I thought was the best 50 psalters and hymnals that I had. So if and I played through every single page of every single one and drove my family crazy. So if your average hymnal has 500 pages, that's, probably 20 something thousand different selections that I work through. That, that includes duplicates, I suppose. But work through those. Um, had my laptop set open on the piano with um, a spreadsheet there and different tabs for psalms, for hymns. And as I came across things that I knew we absolutely had to include, we would color code those. Um, we would mark anything we thought, well, here's a maybe. Let's hang on to this and see if we run across anything better along the way. Um, and include, very carefully annotate sources, author, tune name, what key we would want to sing it in. One of the things we're striving for is to increase musical literacy in the congregation, and so we want to, even if most people are singing the the melody right now, we want to strive toward four-part singing, and so bearing that in mind, what's a good key? Some of the early 20th century hymnals tend to have things set pretty high. So often we would bring things down a half or whole step. Um, uh, all of the source material we would annotate. Um, Along the way, we eventually created indices for subject, uh, tunes, um, meter. We created a very robust scripture index along the way. Um, Most of the work involves combing through all of the resources that you want to draw from. We have a few things that we have written in house that we wanted to include as well. There were a couple areas where um, we did not find a great um, psalm, and so we decided. I have a a co-editor that helped serve in our music, leading our music. He's not with us in the Houston area anymore, but has been very much involved in the project, and we worked together to write a couple things. Um, so we collated all of those things. We decided on our project that we wanted the Psalter section to be set apart. And so in some Psalter hymnals, you find it all just kind of jumbled in together. We preferred the idea of setting the Psalms apart, so that they would be easy to find. Um, I have a copy of the accompanist edition, that's spiral bound that we recently got. We're eagerly waiting the cloth bound, but um, in the first section, so the numbers 1 through Well, it's actually the first 180 something probably, because we have more than one setting of some psalms. Some of them, the most beloved psalms, Psalm 1, 19, 23, or some of the longer psalms, Psalm 119. We've got seven or eight. Um, and um, we put those all together and we did the numbering of that section where you could always find what you were looking for. So if we have two of one, you'll find Psalm 119a and then our 119b and so on. And so you can, if you're reading your Bible and you want to find a psalm setting of that psalm, you can flip right to it and find that. Um, and then, we wanted something that would, on the Psalms, that we wanted to make sure we at least had something for every Psalm that stayed pretty close to the biblical text. And so if there was something that we liked that was more paraphrastic in nature, we also included something that was metricalized, and that followed the biblical text a little bit closer. And then the remaining balance is dedicated to the hymnal portion of that. And again, that's old and new. So we've got everything from ancient things to um, more contemporary, well written hymns from continental Reformed tradition to uh, American, uh, early American hymns, fuguing tunes, everything in between.
Cool. Do you put the you mentioned about having like Psalm 119, for instance, it was A, B, and then you kind of split it up that way. Do you have actually the entire um Psalter, like you can find literally any verse and look at it in the Psalter? Or were there some considerations given to, well, we can't fit the entire psalm in here, so we're gonna have to take kind of the this part of that psalm and um, not maybe not include the entire thing. Was that kind of how it went in some other cases?
There, for the most part, you can find just about everything. There are a few situations where, in Psalm 119, for example, we do not have the entire acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet represented, just because of space limitations in our budget. Um, but there are a couple in Psalm 119 that take a more of a paraphrased approach, and so are reflective of the psalm, if that makes sense.
Um, so you mentioned that you set all of the hymns in a different section of the hymn book than all the Psalms, which I like because um, it puts it into perspective that this is the inspired, this is drawing from the inspired word of God, and this is what we have contributed. And
Yeah,
they're not, there's a practical side of, finding a psalm that you want to sing and finding a hymn that you want to sing. But there's also the kind of the back of your mind subconscious that these two are different, they're drawn from different sources. And I like that. I like that.
they are. It's not that a particular setting of a psalm itself is inspired,
Correct.
but this is based on the inspired word of God,
Okay.
and so these are they're operating on different planes. Yeah.
hmm hmm You also mentioned how you guys are striving for four-part harmonies. If you could elaborate a little bit as to why four-part harmony as opposed to everybody singing the same thing in the congregation.
Yeah, that's an important question. Um, it musical literacy has severely declined in churches in the last couple of generations, and I think a big part of that has been uh, the direct result of casting the hymnal aside. Um, I am at just the right age where I remember when hymnals were disposed of. I grew up singing from a hymnal. I took piano lessons starting from a young age, but the church at large that I grew up in was fairly musically literate. And many would sing parts, and there was a robust music program. And I remember when overhead projectors became a thing and transparencies were used, and then it was shooting lyrics on a screen, and the music disappeared. And with that has come all kinds of consequences. Um, Things have become, hymns themselves have increasingly become set to the side. Some churches, you still might get the token hymn here and there. Um, but larger contemporary bands become the driving force. Songs are set in keys where um, really people are predominantly singing just the melody. And uh, the keys that things are sung in tend to be out of reach for everyone. We do not all have the same register in our the voices God has given us. Men sound different than women, and some men voices are set higher than other men's, and the same is true with women. And so if you look at your average church today, you see, for one, men do not generally sing well. And some of this is because everyone is straining to sing the melody. If people were given some instruction on just simple instruction on how to read a part, sing something that is more suitable to their voice, they would be able to sing with a lot more confidence. They would actually be less self-aware and render to God the kind of worship that He deserves. And the more that that's done, the more it encourages the body around, and it becomes this. There's this phenomenon where people sing with more confidence, and so others in turn do, and you're encouraging one another in your own singing. And so that is something that we have done. It's very much an uphill battle, and we acknowledge that it's taken more than a generation to lose what we have, and it's going to take at least that much time or more to regain. But we think it's a battle worth fighting. And so even though we haven't had hymnals of our own the way we would like to see, we have used folders, and we hand out music every month, and we have had psalm sings and hymn sings in our home. And when we've had small groups, we always sing from printed music. Um, and every once in a while, I'll say, okay, on verse 2, only the men are going to sing. And it's always a good thing to sing just a cappella sometimes, so that everyone suddenly feels exposed, and then generally with enough encouragement, people will rise to the occasion. And but parts are um, so helpful in this, and I think can just really encourage people in the musical worship that they offer to the Lord.
Yeah. Here's an idea that I have, and you can tell me if I'm off on my judgment here, but one thing that I've noticed in my wife's family kind of comes from the backup in their family history. They come from a Mennonite background,
Yeah,
northern Indiana. And so I've been to a couple of Mennonite churches, from where they're at. And it's amazing, to be in a church where they have everybody singing a cappella.
they
And
know how to sing.
the reason for that might be kind of, they might not have the proper theology for why they're singing in a cappella. The hymns that they're singing are definitely maybe not the most
Yeah,
theologically robust hymns. But that said, it's an amazing experience to sit in a church where you flip to a random page in the hymn book and everybody just knows what part to sing.
off we go.
And off
Yeah,
we go. And we didn't have to sit here and hum ha or anything like that. It's just everybody knew, and it's really fun too when you can tell that this is a song that we haven't sung in years, or
yes,
somebody requests a song that nobody else really knows the uh the tune to, or even the parts to. Not to mention that by the second or third verse, everybody's singing in parts because they
yeah,
just know how to, you know, judge by where their part fits in relation to everybody else's. And that note is my note is a C here, and the soprano's singing a C there too. So I'll start there, and then I'll kind of space out from that location.
right. Reading intervals becomes
Right.
more and more instinctual.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's an amazing experience. One common complaint that I've come across is amongst the people who are speaking against the contemporary styles, that it's always set too high, which I completely agree with. It's set way too high for men and it's set too low for women. And then you try to make, that mesh, and you've got men stretching their voices high, which they're not comfortable with. Women will sing regardless. They might sing, an octave high, or they'll sing on the note and stretch their voices lower. It has a very androgynous, horrible sound, really, when you have everyone singing the same note, men and women. It completely removes that sexual distinction of men and women
that's
in the
right.
church, both bringing their own God-given traits to the worship. The one thing that I have noticed that you mentioned too is that you look back at a lot of the older hymns in the 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, and they're set pretty high too. And so
Yeah,
I've often thought to myself, so why are we complaining about contemporary when apparently this has worked before?
yeah,
I think the answer is that there are men are not used to stretching their voices. We sit in offices and we go to work, and we're not required to raise our voices. I think it used to be the more common for men to be working out in the field, and you had to yell at your cohort on the other side of the field. We're just used to raising our voices a little bit more often. The other thing I think kind of goes with that is that when we did have a musical literacy, men whose voices were on a lower register would be able to just slide into the bass line. They
mhm,
wouldn't have to start with melody along with everyone else and stick there. They would just, you know, they would take a verse off or something like that while they figured it out. And then verse two comes along and they slide into the bass line, and they'll figure it out by verse three. But I think that's a significant part too, is that if we had the ability to sing in parts, we really wouldn't have that problem of, oh, the key is set too high or whatnot.
right.
Um, and one of the things that I've noticed along those lines as well is that I think about 70% of men, 60 to 70% are are bass, are on the side of the bass. That's
Or at
about
least in the baritone section.
yep,
Yeah,
on bass, something like that. About 20 to 30% of men are the tenor. And to have a balance between those two, bass is a little bit harder to hear, and you need more people singing bass. So I think God has designed that kind of into our
mm,
into our voices, is that you have just a majority of men who could sing bass and a couple of the louder people who can project singing tenor. And you don't only need a couple of those to be able to hear the tenor quite well. Um, but the bass, you just need more people to hear them.
Um,
What do you think of that? Is that kind of something you see?
yeah, no, I've had very much the same thought. There were obviously most of church history, there's been no amplification when it comes to providing accompaniment for the congregation, um, aside from organ. Um, but the um, the church has been able to sing, and the the melody line has been suitable because sopranos are singing it, and it's well within their reach. Um, it is not within the reach of basses taking that line an octave down and then straining for those notes. And so we see this thing where men just sit out or they mumble along, and um, you know, in some settings, you get to the end of singing a couple hymns and men sit down. They look like, they're done, just sheer exhaustion trying to
Yeah.
keep up with everything. So I do think there's something to that.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the practical side of the thought process going into this. Um, the introduction that you wrote to the that you and the elders wrote to this hymn book talks a lot about kind of the more of the theological side, um, more of the theoretical side of what you would like to see in a hymn book. I loved reading it. I think this is the I I want to say this is probably the best intro I've ever read in a hymn book.
Thank you, brother.
From the perspective of just very good, insightful things that you just brought up in there, and what you're trying to accomplish in publishing a hymn book. Um, one of them is that you mentioned in the intro how worshiping God is something that we need to do with fear and trembling. Could you elaborate a little bit as to how important coming into God's presence with the right frame of mind in this regard is? A lot of people try to water it down like, well, we don't actually have to be afraid of God. We just have to respect God as
Yeah,
we
fear doesn't really mean fear.
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um, yeah, that's such an important question. You Because you can't have biblical worship without that. Um, we we spent a lot of time on that introduction, and um, part of it was because we want we had to restrain ourselves. It kept getting longer and longer. Um, and I don't know how many people read hymnal introductions, but I hope some do. Um, and we wanted something that was a little bit on the polemical side, um, and that actually made an argument for why a church's music should be done in a particular way. So worshiping God in fear and trembling is absolutely foundational to how we approach Him. To worship Him in fear and trembling is to approach Him with a sense of His glory and His greatness in view. Um, One of the things that you find in the modern worship music movement is it's really the opposite. It's that everything tends to be bent inward on self and um, on God's nearness and intimacy of relationship. And there are truths there, right? It is true that God is near to all those that call on Him in truth. But one of the things that we have seen in the last um, 20, 30 years is that this emphasis on God's immanence has really been to the exclusion of his transcendence and of his glory. And we have seen the effects of that in how we approach him. We see that in the content of the kind of music that has been written for the church to sing. Um, God is other. He is not like his creation, and that has to be kept in view when we worship him. There's been a loss of this sense of his magnificence and splendor, and I think really that has been very much reflected in the worship of the church, um, not just in music, but certainly in music. Psalm 2 says, "Serve the Lord in fear, rejoice with trembling." What a strange paradox that is for people who don't know the Lord. But for those who do, that means everything, because we have this mighty God, we have a King, Psalm 2, who sits in the heavens and laughs, who holds the kings of the earth in derision. And yet at the same time, the word invites us to bow down and kiss the Son, to take refuge in him. And other passages bring together those same ideas, where on the one hand, you do have the privilege of drawing near to God and knowing relationship with him, but also the solemnity of that, not at the expense of sobriety and worship. And so Hebrews 12, let us therefore be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Let us therefore worship God with reverence and fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Well, there you've got it. You have gratitude, thankfulness of heart, but also reverence and fear brought together. And you can't lose either. Both have to be maintained, um, as we approach the Lord. Um, he is, Christ is a friend who sticks closer than a brother, but he is more than my buddy, more than a friend. He's a conquering king, and um, these themes need to be reflected in the worship that we bring to him.
Right. I think there would be a lot of problems within the church that would naturally resolve themselves if we actually had a real understanding of the nature of the God who we worship and a proper fear and reverence and joy and thankful spirit when we come into his presence and a boldness. We're
Yes.
called to be bold when we come before the throne. I think if we were able to see God, if he was made visible to us, we would both be terrified out of our minds, and I think we would be too scared to come before him like we are also commanded to do.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a grace there that we cannot see God's full glory with our own eyes. Um,
Right.
on the other hand,
But the,
since we can't, we're called to still treat him with the same amount of fear and reverence. And
yeah.
yeah.
If the saints tremble and fall down before angels,
Hmm.
how
How much
much
more?
more?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. You make a point in your intro as well, for staying away from songs which embrace vain repetition. One pushback that I've heard from people is that, well, the Psalms have a lot of repetition too. So why can't we have repetition in our corporate worship? Um,
Yeah.
but of course, those two repetitions are different.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So what's the key word is vain. Vain repetition. All repetition is not bad. Repetition can be helpful, but vain repetition, and as you said, this is something we emphasize in the introduction. That belongs to false religion, and um, elders need to be saying as much in the church today because we have much vain repetition. Um, Going on in the worship of the church today, to the degree that we've coined this term 7-Eleven songs where you've got seven words that are repeated ad nauseum, and people do contest the idea of repetition. Looking at Psalms, you've got Psalm 136 is a good example where you have for his steadfast love endures forever as a refrain in every single verse. Um, 20 something verses there, but the thing to mark in your mind is that that refrain is interjected as a response to this the whole story of God's redemption for his old covenant people, taking them all the way um, from Egypt, deliverance out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. And one of the things that we said in that preface is that the purpose of the refrain is instructive. It's not there to um, to whip people up into a frenzy. It's not there so you can get lost in the music. That's not the purpose. The purpose is so that the heart and the mind are engaged in what is being said about God's redemptive purposes in the world. People are constrained to lift their minds and their affections to the Lord in response to what he has done. That is very different from what you see in a lot of modern worship songs and choruses where the same phrase is repeated over and over again. The way you would find in mantras in pagan worship, where um, a series of chord progressions changes underneath, but one thing is said over and over again, um, and that is just not simply that's just not what characterizes the lawful use of repetition that you see in the scriptures.
The cognizant, worshipful use of repetition. The an interesting along those lines. My in-laws are missionaries in Mexico. We're going to be joining them eventually. Um, they're ministering to a pagan Indian tribe down there,
Mhm.
making subtle progress. But they have personally witnessed a lot of their worship ceremonies as
Yeah,
pagan, worship ceremonies with sacrifices and all that sort of stuff. The mind-numbing repetition is very potent, and very present at each of those gatherings. There's also a Catholic presence there as well, and same thing. It's
yes,
the repetition, the repeating of the prayers. They're doing the rosary over and over and over and over and over again.
yeah,
Um, Same thing in Buddhism or Hinduism or any part of the world, where you have unreached pagan people groups. Um, that's what you'll find. And then in an ironic sense, that's what you find in modern contemporary worship as well. It's a returning to worshiping a different God almost is what it seems like. um,
Yes.
worshiping God in the wrong way, which is ever since the Israelites set up a golden calf, we've been struggling with that, it seems like.
That's right. That's right.
Um, Another kind of along those lines, you mentioned applying ourselves to the, you know, producing rather than putting ourselves to sleep. Where it's not a that's kind of the two different um that's where the fault lines exist. It's we either slip into a vain repetition, putting our minds to sleep, or it's a fruitful outpouring of our praise and worship to God. The Greek word for muse follows this. If you The muse is to give you inspiration. That's where our word music comes from, and the opposite of that, amuse, is to entertain ourselves, to put ourselves to sleep. And so it's interesting that our music is now amusing to us instead of the other way around, like it should be.
Right. And uh, we should be sober-minded
Hmm.
in our worship.
Right.
Um, Part of loving the Lord your God with all of your mind means that you're cognizant of what you're singing. You are engaged in the mental faculties that the Lord has given you, thinking as well as feeling and affect the affection of the heart. Um, but so much of that has been lost today.
Yeah. Yep. Where should instruments come into play during congregational worship?
Mm.
And how should they be used when they do exist?
Well, if you were to ask most people, they would say they should be there all the time and as many of them as possible. Uh,
As loud as
um,
possible.
yes, that's right. I beg to differ. Um, the thing to stress is that the voice is primary. The voice is the instrument that God has given us. Some of our American forefathers were so convinced of this that they named their hymnal the sacred harp, and the harp there is a reference to your vocal cords. And this was designed and is still being sung today in some quarters to be sung a cappella, pretty much exclusively. And so instruments can be helpful, but that what I would want to emphasize is they can be helpful, but only in the service of the church. When they are used, it should be used to support and to encourage congregational singing. That's the thing that is mandated. That's the thing that we're commanded to offer to the Lord. So instruments should never take center stage. That shouldn't be the thing that we're focused on. We should never be, if we ever reach a point where this feels like a performance and then the body of Christ function like spectators, something has gone awry. Um, And so I'm generally in favor of a less is more kind of approach. I think piano is a good place to start, to provide a foundation. It's something that can help the congregation hear the melody, hear parts along the way, provide a bed that can support the church's singing. When I introduce a hymn of the month, I'll typically play through the hymn once, just instrumentally, all the way through. Allow people to hear it, and then we'll join in. And one of the elements of faithful biblical worship is Ephesians 5. We're to address one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. making melody in your hearts to God. So um, if I can't hear my neighbor, um, something is 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 wrong. Worship is not just a private experience that we are to have with our eyes closed and the lights down low. We're to address one another. We need to be able to see and hear one another. So piano is a good place to start. It can help people hear what they need to hear, and then other instruments can be used tastefully along the way. We have a violinist, um, happens to be my wife, who plays, and she can help reinforce the tune. She can move to an alto part. Um, and just enrich the accompaniment in a tasteful way. Beyond that sort of thing, I would just use instruments sparingly, honestly, and tread lightly. A small ensemble can be nice, but there are some things that need to be taken into consideration, and a trained musician can help in this, but the size of your space matters. Do you have a lot of hard surfaces in a small room? Well, then a great big brass section is probably not going to serve you well. Um, you know, Ideally, you have both elders and trained musicians, at least someone, or maybe an elder who is gifted in the area of music, who can help um, make these kinds of decisions and direct the body. And then again, I think I mentioned before, but as it relates to instruments, it's always appropriate to break away entirely from instrumentation. When the church knows something well, sing a cappella. One of the things I find is when we do that, especially on something that I know that the church really enjoys to sing, if I allow the piano to drop out, all of a sudden the congregation just rises, and the voices really soar.
Interesting. It seems to me that kind of along kind of along those lines is that when you get a big band up there, when a lot of people are or when there's a lot of sound going on, when the music is being done primarily by the worship band, it gives you less of a reason to sing and use your voice. It's like, well, if I were to sing, there would be no change, and the corporate results of this, which is a lot
Yeah,
different from being able to say, there's 50 people in here or there's 150 people in here. Nobody's singing tenor. Or there's maybe one or two people and they need some help. If I were to sing tenor too, it would it would sound different. Or if I were to sing alto really well, it would sound different. Or if I were to sing bass, it would help these three guys next to me who aren't really singing, and I know it's because they don't know the bass and they look like of that register. So I think once that highlights an interesting point where if you just force the congregation to produce its own music, it's
yeah,
going to do it. It's
yeah.
not a horrible thing, and they're not going to leave your church because they had to make their own music.
That's
Um,
right.
it's not horrifying. Um, yeah, I like the point you made too about if you do have instruments, the voice. Keep in mind that the voice is still primary. We're
Absolutely.
not trying to replace the voice. I've been to a church where it's time to sing, and a third of the church stood up and went to the front, and each hooked up to their separate instruments.
Yes.
There was still only one vocalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so we lost a third of the church, and we've got one vocalist up there, who he's the only one you can hear anyway. So
Yeah.
whatever, you know. Um, I like to the idea of if you're going to play instruments, that's fine. Keep them low key, keep them kind of
Yeah.
hearable but not overpowering. Have them play the parts that the congregation is actually supposed to sing, and it'll make it a lot easier as kind of a springboard for them to do congregational singing in their own parts. Um, yeah, the voice is primary.
Yes.
So so as you're producing a hymn book, there's a decent amount of cost that goes into it, and for your purposes as a church, if you have some technological ability and whatnot, um, I would be able to I could I guess I could see it maybe possible to just have it as a like an ebook, as a PDF or something like that. You could give people, have it on their phones or have on their iPads or computers. You could put it on the screen. You opted to actually do a physical book with all of
Yeah.
these in there, um, which my gut instinct says is worth it, because there's a difference between just seeing words on a screen and being able to flip to the page yourself and look at it yourself and all that sort of stuff. Maybe help me, um, to give some reasoning a little bit more coherently as to why that's a good thing. Why is a book in your own hands a good thing as a congregant?
Yeah. Um, One thing just on the legality side that should be taken into consideration. A lot of churches do have supplemental resources, a folder, something like that, of things they pick up. Um, it is important that churches follow copyright laws and that those who hold copyright get the royalties and such that are due. And so, in some situations, depending on what you might want to include, you may not be at liberty just to make your own, um, technically speaking. So, um, if you work with a publisher, um, they can handle all of that for you. And that's something I didn't mention earlier, but we, in the middle of this process, once we kind of defined our terms and figured out where we were going, we reached out to somebody that does this very thing and knew all of the things that we all know. Um, uh, we're working with Dan Kreider. He's with Hymnworks, is his organization. I think it's hymnworks.com. But he's worked, if you're familiar with the recent hymnal that Getty's put out, or um, I think he had his hands in Grace Community Church's hymnal where MacArthur was. But he helps churches big and small produce custom hymnals. So um, you're right. There are other approaches you can take. Um, you could put together something, a digital resource. You could put together a PDF or a handout. Um, a hymnal is always going to work. That's just one simple fact of the matter. It's always going to work when the power goes out or the internet is down. We've had a couple of weeks um, in the course of my ministry I can think of where things have hit the fan and you can't get the projectors running and slides aren't cooperating and that sort of thing. And you have to feel for the folks who are faithfully serving in the AV booth because they only get any attention when something goes wrong. Um, and somebody delays advancing the screen and everyone turns around. um, you don't have that problem with a hymnal. um, and so hymnals have some advantages. They help avoid many of just the distractions that screens and devices and that sort of thing tends to bring. Um, Positively, you can set a hymnal on your bedside, and you can use it in devotions. Um, you can take it to the nursing home, and you can sing out of a hymnal with dying saints, and you can use it during family worship. My kids are older now, but when they were little, I wouldn't have wanted to give them devices um, to sing from. Um, just as far as the contrast between a hymnal and words on a screen, hymnals are going to help push back against that problem of musical illiteracy in the church. The church needs to reclaim sacred music, and hymnals can help in that. Um, our family has collected hymnals, and we at times have sung straight through, lots and lots of different hymnals and psalters, and said, okay, we love that, we hate that, and that's been part of what in the last 10 years or so I've used to kind of collect this list um, that we've been building upon that's now taking shape into this hymnal. But my own family, um, we're looking to purchase enough copies for us so that we could have a big uh, hymn psalm sing at our home. But we're also planning to give, to have enough on hand so that we can give a good stack to each of our kids, because we're praying for lots of grandkids. And so, a well-bound hymnal can last, several generations. And we hope the Lord will use it to that end.
Amen. There's a there's a reality present when you have the hymn book in your hands and when you're responsible, to sing out of that hymn book and it's in your home and you go to church and there's one exactly like it at church. It really sends home the idea that, on a subconscious level that I'm responsible to bring a musical contribution to this corporate worship. It's not something that I go to church and, they've been practicing all week and they know what the
Yes.
deal is. They'll have the words on the screen for me. I'll just follow along and I'll
I take it all in.
take it all in. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And then I go home. I can attest to, being in a church where it's on the screen and something happens. The words
yeah,
glitch out and everybody stops singing because we don't know what's going on here. We're just along for the ride, sort of thing.
yeah,
And if there's not words on the screen telling us exactly what to do next, when we need to do it, um, I guess the band knows what they're doing, so it's no big issue. Uh, but yeah, and then you occasionally get the head turns around to the who's in charge
yeah.
of that sound sort of thing.
But you're right. We have a couple months ago we put out order forms for the congregation. Um, I brought this whole project to the church last year, after we had thought through things and kind of got a sense of what this would cost us, and um, really thankful to have a congregation that was enthusiastic and supportive. But a couple of months ago, it was finally time to put out order forms. And because part of our vision is not just to use this in public worship, but in private and family worship. And so, it's been exciting to see families sign up and order some, and then even kids who, their parents are ordering enough for their family, but they're thinking down the road, and that they're ordering some of paying out of their own, piggy bank, so that when they leave home one day, they've got their own copy. And so we're looking forward to seeing how this shapes the worship of our church in the years to come.
That is awesome. I love that. Having the kids being cognizant enough to and enthusiastic enough about the project, and about just being musically literate and establishing a culture of singing, not just in their homes now, but in their future homes.
Yeah,
That's really cool. I like
yeah.
that. So, do you think the age of seeing new exclusively hymn books published is a thing of the past? Like you're doing a Psalter hymnal. I see a bunch of other people doing Psalter hymnals, and I love that. Um, one thing that I love seeing the church realize is that it's not sufficient to just sing hymns. We are required to sing psalms, and so I love the fact that we are publishing books that reflect that, publishing resources that we use that have both psalms and hymns. Would you say that, maybe 20 years down the road, we see a lot less hymn books being published?
That's a good question. I do think that we have, at least in the Reformed Church, that unfortunately, heretofore in many, not everywhere, but in many traditions, has been infected with the modern worship movement. Um, there has been an awakening and an awareness, a dissatisfaction. People have realized, okay, there's some bad fruit that has been born out of just indiscriminately adopting, the latest trendy thing out there. And so people are um, thinking about, okay, what does that mean then? What changes need to take place? And in some circles, that's been a return to um, old standby hymns. Some are um, characterized more by the modern hymn writing movement. Um, and those are both good, but both of those in themselves fall short of what we're called to in the scriptures. And I'm thinking specifically of what you said in terms of psalm singing. And so, certainly, my prayer would be that with time, that reformation continues and more and more psalm singing is implemented. In some of our more conservative Reformed traditions, there is still some psalm singing that goes on. I'm not aware of great complete psalters that are being produced. Um, I know of some more recent, what I would describe as kind of quasi Psalter hymnals, where there's a good representation of some psalms included, kind of scattered about. Um, but um, we felt, well, if we were going to really go after this and tackle a Psalter hymnal, we want the whole Psalter represented. A setting of it, at least one of every single psalm, and so I trust the Lord will continue to work in His church and bring reformation, and in the years to come, I do think more of this will be seen. I've talked with um, churches in our area, and there seems to be an interest when I've shared what we're doing with fellow brother pastors. Um, Ears perk up, and there's at least one other church that has already signed on and wants to order some of what we're doing. So that's been encouraging.
Yeah, yeah. It's sad that we live in times, excuse me. It's sad that we live in times where we have lost the musical heritage that we used to have. But on the other hand, it's exciting to at least be living in times where we have realized our error, you know,
Yes,
and we're at least heading back in the right direction. I would imagine it was pretty it would have been pretty discouraging to live in the 1960s, 70s, 80s and be one of those older churchgoers where you knew, what people were disregarding and losing. And the younger generation was just completely, unheeding to your warnings and going
Yes.
off into who knows where. And I would imagine that would have been pretty discouraging from the older generation who knew what was being lost during that time. Um, but I'm sure some of them are still alive to sort of kind of see the turning back at this point.
I was speaking with an older gentleman at a pastor's conference just a couple months ago. He's probably in his 80s, and um, he had spent decades in a psalm singing church, and was just speaking with such love for how enriching an experience that had been. And he had recently needed to relocate, I think, because of health issues to be closer to his children, and was in a church that was conservative and, understood the regulative principle by and large, and um, but used the Trinity hymnal, which is not a terrible hymnal. There's some things that are good in there, and um, but there were very few psalms being sung, and you could just see it in his face. What a loss this was to him. So we do need to heed those warnings.
Seems to me that in my limited research that kind of during the time of the Second Great Awakening, when we were doing a lot more tent revivals, emotionalistic type of tent meeting settings, the church in America basically, by and large, the growing emerging church in America lost its psalm singing during that time, and
Mm,
we primarily switched over to hymn books during the early 1900s to mid 1900s. We had just about completely, lost the psalm singing characteristics of the church, and we were all on just hymn books.
yeah,
And I think that had a natural progression to the contemporary style. Um, even though it was still old hymns, and that's everybody, who grew up in the, 1940s, 50s, and then started seeing the contemporary style come in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Um, they would all harken back to the old hymns that they had
yes,
once sung, not realizing necessarily that it was the old hymns which had gotten them to that spot. I think
that's
the
right.
the initial sin of the church was leaving the psalm singing um,
Yeah,
that it used to do.
yeah. And a lot of what folks in some of those generations um, refer to as hymns really are those what I would describe as camp meeting songs,
Right.
revivalistic type things that came out of that Second Great Awakening movement.
hmm hmm Very cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. Are you planning to make this Psalter hymnal available to purchase for the public eventually?
That's a good question. We're not in a situation where we can warehouse and inventory
Sure.
things. Although um, my understanding is that you know a lot of the expense is the upfront cost of editing and producing and doing all of the layout and that sort of thing. And so once that's out of the way, actually printing um, is fairly reasonable. Um, so if there's a church out there that's interested, and if you want to order enough copies, um, they're welcome to reach out to me, and I can make a phone call and see if we can make something happen. Um, and if there are churches that are interested in doing something of their own as well, um, I'd be glad to point them in the right direction or talk about what a custom hymnal would look like.
Cool. I'll put some contact info for you in the
Sure.
description. So you can, if you're interested in getting this hymnal, you can get in touch with Brian and we'll talk. So if anyone in Houston and the Houston area wants to attend a Reformed Baptist church that is seeking a robust theology of psalms and hymns, uh, where should they go? What church in kind of the southern Houston area?
Grace Family Church is where I labor among others, and we would certainly love to welcome anyone in our area. Come and see us. We'll
There we go.
sing heartily to the Lord together.
Amen. Amen. I was getting a blank as to what the name of the church was, but Grace Family Church, Pearland, Texas.
That's
And
right.
Brian, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my joy.
All right. Well, until next time, for us, you folks, sing heartily, sing daily, and sing psalms. This is Worship Reformation.
Attend our armies to the fight and be their guardian God. In vain shall numerous powers unite against thy lifted rod. Our troops beneath thy guiding hand shall gain a glad renown. 'Tis God who makes the feeble stand and treads the mighty down.